Stay in that cabin if you want to freeze to death, my daughter-in-law Rachel said, her voice light, almost amused, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of deciding where we would spend the worst storm of the decade. And my son Daniel stood beside her, silent, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed somewhere past me like I was already gone, and I remember nodding, not because I agreed, but because I had learned long ago that arguing only gave them something to push against, so I simply closed the door after they left, the sound soft but final, like the end of something I hadn't quite named yet, and outside the wind had already started to rise, low and steady, carrying that dry, cutting cold that seeps through walls and settles into your bones, the kind of cold that makes people second-guess their choices. But inside our cabin, Walter was already adjusting the stove, his movements calm, familiar, like this was just another winter evening and not the beginning of a blizzard that would shut down the entire town. And I set the table the way I always did. 2 plates, 2 cups, the good silverware even though there was no one left to impress, because habits like that don't disappear just because people stop noticing. And as the first wave of snow hit the windows, sharp and fast, I caught my reflection in the glass. A woman of 72 with steady hands and eyes that had seen more than she ever said out loud. And for a moment, I thought about what Rachel had said, not the words themselves, but the certainty behind them, the way she had already decided how this would end for us, as if we were a problem that winter would solve for her. And somewhere down the road, I imagined their house, modern, bright, dependent on power that could fail at any moment, while ours, the one they called outdated, stood quiet and self-contained, built layer by layer over decades they never cared to understand. And when the lights flickered once, then went out completely, across the valley, the silence that followed was immediate, heavy, the kind that makes you realize just how much of your life depends on things you don't control. But our cabin didn't change, the warmth stayed, steady and constant, wrapping around us like it always had. And Walter looked at me, not with worry, but with something closer to knowing, and I realized then that this storm wasn't going to prove what they thought it would. It was going to reveal something else entirely, something they had overlooked for years. And as the wind howled louder, pressing against the walls, I simply sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. The night settled in deeper after the power went out across the valley, and for a while there was nothing but the wind pressing against the walls and the steady crackle of the stove, a sound that felt almost louder in the silence. And I realized how different this house felt compared to the one Daniel had insisted we should move into last year. The one with wide glass windows and polished floors that looked beautiful, but never quite felt like it belonged to us. And I remembered the way Rachel had walked through our cabin back then, her heels clicking against the old wooden boards as she glanced around with that polite smile that never reached her eyes, commenting on how small everything was, how outdated, how impractical for people our age, as if comfort could be measured in square footage or modern appliances. And I had nodded then too, the same way I had nodded earlier that day, letting her speak, letting her believe she understood something she had never taken the time to learn. And Walter had said very little during that visit, just the occasional quiet remark about how the house had been built to last, how every beam and layer had a purpose, but they had not really listened, because people rarely listen when they have already decided what they think is best. And now, as the temperature outside dropped well below zero and the storm thickened into something heavier, something that erased the road and blurred the outlines of everything beyond our windows, I moved through the cabin slowly, checking each room out of habit, my hand brushing against the walls as if to confirm what I already knew, that the warmth was holding, that nothing had changed. And in the kitchen the kettle began to hum softly, a quiet promise of something simple and steady. And I poured 2 cups of tea, the steam rising gently in the dim light. And when I handed one to Walter, he gave me that small nod again, the kind that carried more meaning than words ever could. And for a moment, I thought about Daniel, about the way he used to sit at this same table years ago, his hands wrapped around a mug just like this, asking questions about how the house worked, how we had built it piece by piece over time, before life became busier, before opinions that were not his own started to take root. And I wondered when exactly that shift had happened, when curiosity had been replaced by certainty, when listening had turned into deciding for us what we needed. And outside the wind grew louder, pushing snow against the windows in thick waves, But inside nothing wavered. The air remained steady, the warmth constant, as if the house itself was quietly proving a point no one had asked it to make. And I sat back down, wrapping my hands around the cup, feeling the heat settle into my fingers. And I realized that this storm was not just something to get through. It was something that would reveal who understood what truly mattered and who had only been pretending all along. By morning, the storm had settled into something heavier, quieter, the kind that made the world feel paused, as if everything beyond our walls had been carefully erased. And when I pulled back the curtain just slightly, all I could see was white, thick layers of snow pressed against the windows, swallowing the path that once led down to the road. And I realized no one would be coming this way anytime soon, not out of choice at least. And yet the thought did not unsettle me the way it might have years ago, because inside the cabin everything continued as it always had, steady and predictable. The warmth held in place not by chance, but by design, something Walter had explained countless times in the past, how the structure was built in layers, how air moved through spaces unseen, how heat was trapped and redirected. But those explanations had always been met with polite nods and quick changes of subject, especially from Rachel, who preferred clean lines and new materials over anything that required patience to understand. And I could still hear her voice from that afternoon months ago when she stood in this very room, arms crossed lightly as she suggested we would be safer somewhere modern, somewhere easier to maintain, her tone wrapped in concern but anchored in certainty, as if she had already decided what was best for us. And Daniel had followed her lead, repeating her points in his own words, softer but no less firm, until the conversation became less about options and more about inevitability. And I had watched them both then, noticing how easily they spoke about moving us out, about letting go of this place, as if it were just a structure and not something we had spent decades building piece by piece, decision by decision. And now, standing in that same room, while the storm pressed harder against the outside world, I found myself thinking not about what we might lose, but about what they had failed to see. And somewhere in the distance, faint but distinct, there was a sound that did not belong to the wind, a low mechanical strain that rose and fell before cutting off completely. And I knew without needing to confirm that it came from the direction of town, where power lines and generators were not built for conditions like this. And I imagined houses going dark one by one, heaters falling silent, people stepping into rooms that no longer felt safe. And for a brief moment, I wondered if Daniel had prepared for that, if he had considered what would happen when the systems he trusted stopped working. But the thought passed quickly, replaced by a quieter realization that this was no longer something I needed to anticipate for him. And I let the curtain fall back into place, turning away from the window as Walter added another piece of wood to the stove, the flame catching slowly, deliberately, and I returned to the table, my hands resting calmly against the surface, aware now that the distance between us and the rest of the world was not just measured in miles of snow, but in understanding, in choices made long before the storm ever arrived. The hours passed without urgency, the kind of slow, stretched time that only comes when there is nowhere else to be and nothing left to check. And I noticed how the cabin seemed to settle deeper into itself, as if it had been waiting for a moment like this to prove what it was made of. And I moved through each room again, not out of worry but out of quiet observation, the walls warm to the touch, the air steady, not a single draft slipping through the seams. And I remembered how many times Daniel had questioned those walls, tapping lightly against them with a skeptical smile, asking why they were thicker than necessary, why the structure seemed heavier than modern standards. And Walter had always answered the same way, patiently, explaining the double layers, the narrow space between them, how air could act as a barrier when guided correctly. But those explanations had never stayed long in Daniel's mind, not when there were newer, faster solutions being suggested to him. And I paused near the window again, brushing away a small patch of frost just enough to see beyond it. And the view had changed in a way that felt almost unreal. The outlines of neighboring houses completely gone now, the road erased entirely, replaced by an unbroken field of white that stretched farther than I could follow. And for a moment I imagined the rest of the town, the uncertainty settling into homes that were not built for silence, people checking switches that no longer responded, opening doors to cold air that did not belong inside. And I thought about Rachel again, about The way she had laughed softly when she said we would not last one night here. How confident she had been in that assumption. And I realized it had never really been about the storm for her. It had been about control, about deciding what was right for us without ever asking what we had already chosen for ourselves. And I stepped back from the window, letting the frost reclaim the glass, and returned to the living room where Walter sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees, not tense, not concerned, just present in a way that felt grounding. And I sat across from him, the space between us filled not with words, but with years of understanding that did not need to be spoken. And somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, there was another sound, this time sharper, the distant echo of something struggling against the storm before fading again. And I knew then that whatever systems the town relied on were failing one by one. And that realization did not bring satisfaction, only clarity, because it was never about being right. It was about seeing what others refused to see until it was too late. And as the light shifted slightly through the storm clouds, dim and gray, I felt something settle within me, not fear, not relief, but a quiet certainty that this moment, this isolation, was not an accident. It was the result of choices made long before the first snow ever fell, choices that were now revealing themselves in ways no one could ignore. By the second night, the storm had grown into something relentless, not louder, not more dramatic, but heavier in a way that pressed down on everything unseen. And I could feel the difference not in the air inside our home, which remained steady and warm, but in the silence beyond it, a silence that carried weight, as if the rest of the world had begun to slow under the strain. And I found myself standing near the window again, not to look out, because there was nothing left to see, but to listen, to notice what had changed. And it was then that I heard it clearly, the distant hum of engines struggling somewhere far off, uneven and strained, rising briefly before cutting out altogether. And I knew that sound, the kind that comes from generators pushed beyond what they were built to handle. And I imagined Daniel's house, the bright lights he had trusted, the systems Rachel had praised, all depending on something that could fail without warning. And for a moment I pictured them, moving from room to room, checking switches, adjusting thermostats that no longer responded, the warmth slipping away slowly at first, then all at once. And I turned back toward the center of the room where Walter sat, the fire reflecting softly in his eyes. And I realized he had heard it too, that same distant interruption. But he said nothing, because there was nothing to say, only something to understand. And I walked into the kitchen, placing another log near the stove, the motion simple, practiced, something my hands remembered without effort. And as the flame caught again, steady and controlled, I thought about the years it had taken to build this place into what it was, the decisions made quietly, without needing approval, the small adjustments over time that had never seemed important to anyone else. And I remembered how easily those choices had been dismissed, how quickly Rachel had reduced them to outdated habits, how confidently Daniel had agreed. And I wondered if they were thinking about that now, if they were remembering the conversations they had brushed aside, or if they were still waiting for something external to solve what was happening around them. And the thought did not linger long, because outside the storm continued without pause, the kind of persistence that does not negotiate. And inside our home the warmth held, not by chance, not by luck, but by something far more deliberate. And I returned to the table, sitting down slowly, my hands resting against the wood, feeling the quiet strength of it beneath my fingers. And in that moment I understood that this was no longer just about weather or survival. It was about recognition, about seeing clearly what had always been there. And as another distant sound faded into silence beyond the storm, I knew that somewhere, not too far from us, reality was beginning to settle in for those who had once believed they knew better. By the third morning the storm had not weakened, but something else had changed, something quieter, more deliberate. And I noticed it first in the stillness between the gusts of wind, in the way the outside world no longer sounded distant but absent, as if everything beyond our walls had paused in place. And I stood near the door for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the handle, not to open it, but to feel the difference, the subtle contrast between what was held inside and what waited beyond. And the wood was warm beneath my palm, steady, unbothered. And I thought about how many times that door had been dismissed as old, as insufficient, how easily Rachel had suggested replacing it with something newer. something she believed would perform better. And I let out a quiet breath, not in relief, but in recognition, because it was never about appearances, it was about understanding what something was built to do. And behind me, I could hear Walter moving slowly, adding another log, adjusting the airflow with the same quiet precision he had used for years, and I realized that nothing we were doing now was reactive, nothing was rushed. Everything followed a rhythm that had been set long before this storm ever arrived, and that rhythm was the reason we were still comfortable while the rest of the town was not. And as I stepped away from the door, I caught a faint sound again, but this time it was different, not mechanical, not distant, but closer, irregular, something breaking through the silence in uneven intervals, and I paused, listening carefully, the sound coming and going between the wind, just enough to suggest movement where there should have been none, and I moved toward the window, clearing a small space in the frost with the edge of my sleeve. And at first there was nothing, just the same endless white. But then, far at the edge of where the road used to be, I saw it, a shape barely distinguishable from the snow, shifting slowly, struggling forward, and I did not need to guess who it might be, because there were only so many reasons someone would try to reach us in conditions like this, and I felt no urgency, no sudden need to act, only a quiet awareness that what we had anticipated without speaking was now unfolding exactly as it would, and I let the frost settle back over the glass, turning away before the figure became clear, because the details did not matter yet, only the fact that they were coming. And as I returned to the center of the room, sitting down once more across from Walter, I understood that the distance between us and them was no longer measured by the storm, but by the choices that had led them here, step by step, until there was nowhere else left to go. The sound came again, closer this time, uneven and deliberate, like footsteps that had already gone too far to turn back, and I did not rush to the door. I did not call out. I simply sat there for a moment longer, letting the silence settle around it, because there was something in that hesitation, something in the way it broke through the stillness, that told me everything I needed to know. And Walter did not look up right away either, but I could tell he had heard it, the slight shift in his posture, the pause in his movement, enough to confirm that this was no longer just the storm pressing in, it was someone reaching through it. And when the knock finally came, it was not strong, not confident, just a dull, careful sound against the wood, as if whoever stood outside was no longer certain of anything. And I stood then, slowly, my hands steady, not because I was calm, but because there was no reason not to be, and I walked toward the door, each step measured, the warmth of the cabin following me as I moved closer to the cold that waited on the other side. And for a brief moment my hand rested against the handle again, just as it had earlier, feeling the same quiet strength beneath it, the same boundary that had kept everything inside safe while the outside changed in ways no one could control. And I opened the door just enough to see them. Daniel first, his face pale from the cold, his shoulders tense beneath layers that were no longer enough, and Rachel just behind him, her expression tighter than I had ever seen it, the certainty gone, replaced by something she could not quite hide. And neither of them spoke immediately, not the way they usually did, not with the same ease or assumption. And I noticed that more than anything else, the silence between us stretching longer than expected, as if they were waiting for something that had not yet been offered. And I stepped back slightly, allowing the warmth from inside to reach them without inviting them in, just enough for them to feel the difference. And Daniel finally looked at me, really looked this time, not past me, not through me, but at me. And in that moment I saw the shift clearly, the understanding beginning to form where there had once only been certainty. And Rachel's eyes moved quickly around the room behind me, taking in what she had dismissed before, measuring it now in a way she had never needed to. And I did not ask why they had come. I did not need to, because the storm had already answered that question for them. And as the cold air lingered between us, waiting for a decision to be made, I realized that this moment was not about whether they would step inside. It was about whether they understood what it meant to be here at all. For a moment, no one moved. Not even the wind seemed to press as hard against the walls, as if the storm itself had paused to see what would happen next. And Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his boots leaving faint marks on the threshold where snow had begun to melt. And I noticed how carefully he stood, as if unsure whether he belonged on either side of that door. And Rachel pulled her coat tighter around her, her eyes still scanning the room behind me, lingering on the stove, the walls, the quiet steadiness she had once dismissed. And when she finally spoke, her voice was lower than I had ever heard it, stripped of the sharp certainty it used to carry. And she said they had lost power hours ago, that the backup system had failed, that the house had grown colder faster than they expected. And I listened without interrupting, not because I needed the explanation, but because I wanted to hear how she chose to say it, how she framed what had happened now that the outcome was no longer in her control. And Daniel added a few words of his own, something about the roads being blocked, about how they had tried to wait it out, but could not anymore. And I nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because the details did not change what was already clear, and I stepped back another inch, allowing more warmth to reach them, just enough for them to feel the difference more fully, the contrast between what they had left behind and what stood in front of them now. And I saw it then, not in their words but in the way their shoulders eased just slightly, the way their eyes softened as the heat reached them, and I realized that this was the moment they had never prepared for, the moment where understanding did not come from being told, but from standing in the result of their own decisions. And I turned my head briefly toward Walter, who remained seated, calm, his presence steady as always, and there was no question between us, no need to ask what should happen next, because we both understood that this was not about punishment or pride. It was about clarity, about whether they could see now what had been invisible to them before. And I looked back at Daniel, at the way he held himself differently now, not with the quiet distance he had shown before, but with something closer to uncertainty. And I realized that this storm had done more than cut power lines or block roads. It had removed the illusion of control they had relied on, and what remained was something simpler, something harder to ignore. And as the cold air lingered between us, waiting to be replaced, I knew that whatever happened next would not erase what had been said before, but it would define what they chose to understand now. The silence lingered for a second longer before I stepped aside, not fully, just enough to make the space visible, and Daniel hesitated before crossing the threshold, his movement slower than I had ever seen it, as if he understood that stepping inside meant more than escaping the cold. And Rachel followed closely behind, her eyes adjusting to the warmth, to the steady air that wrapped around them without effort. And I closed the door gently, the sound soft but final, sealing out the storm once again. And for a moment none of us spoke, the difference between inside and outside settling over them in a way that words never could. And I watched as Daniel removed his gloves, his fingers stiff at first before slowly relaxing. And Rachel stood near the entrance, her coat still wrapped tightly around her, as if she had not yet decided whether she was staying or only passing through. And I walked back toward the table, taking my seat without looking back immediately, giving them time to absorb what they were feeling, what they were seeing, because this was not something that could be explained. It had to be recognized. And after a few seconds, Daniel moved further into the room, his gaze lingering on the walls, the ceiling, the stove, as if trying to understand something he had once ignored. And he finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, asking how the house was still warm when everything else had failed. And I did not answer right away, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted him to sit with that question for a moment, to feel the weight of it. And when I finally looked at him, I kept my voice calm, steady, the same way it had always been. And I told him that nothing here had failed because nothing here had been left to chance, that every part of this house had been built with intention, with patience, with the understanding that not everything can be controlled from the outside. And Rachel shifted slightly, her eyes lowering for just a second before lifting again, and I could see it then, the realization forming, not all at once, but enough to change the way she stood, the way she listened. And I did not need to say anything more than that, because the rest was already around them, in the warmth they could feel, in the silence that no longer threatened. And I rested my hands on the table, the wood steady beneath my fingers, and I added one final thought, not as a lesson, not as a warning, but simply as the truth as I had always known it, that this home was built to keep us warm, not just from the cold outside, but from the kind of certainty that makes people forget to listen. And as the storm continued beyond the walls, I watched them stand there, no longer certain, no longer distant, and I knew that what they understood now would stay with them long after the snow was gone.